Chelsea Handler has traveled to Berlin on her quest to learn whether her grandfather Karl was affiliated with the Nazi Party during World War II.
I'm eager to meet with military historian Roger Morehouse, whom I've asked to look into Karl's service records. I'm curious about my grandfather's experience in the Army, and I hope to finally find out where my grandfather stood with the Nazi regime.
I've been trying to figure out whether or not he was sympathetic to the Nazi regime, if he was kind of a willing participant just because of the circumstances, or if he was a Nazi enthusiast.
Okay.
Which is kind of important for me to know.
Of course. You're certainly in the right place. I mean, here, where we are now is the German Military Records Office, which has all the records of German soldiers and airmen through both World Wars. I've looked at some of the records here in Berlin, and I can confirm to you that he wasn't a member of the SS, not a Nazi Party member, and not a member of the SA.
Well, that's good to know.
That is not necessarily a clean bill of health.
Right.
You know, there's many, many shades of grey in Nazi Germany. If you bear in mind that, you know, Nazi Party membership was only 10% of the population, and yet there was, within the rest of the population, there's an awful lot that people that could be complicit and could have done some awful things as well.
Okay.
One way that we can perhaps get an insight into his sympathies is to look at his military document. This is your grandfather's Salzbuch, which is his army paybook. This gives you a lot of details about him and about his army career, so this is a very good resource for us answering some of those questions.
Okay.
So this date here is important. His war starts on the 22nd of September 1939, which is quite early. This is only three weeks after the outbreak of war.
Does the date that he entered the war have any leaning towards how enthusiastic he was? I mean, do we know if he wanted to go into the war at that time?
Not particularly. You'd imagine so, that it might suggest enthusiasm, but he's conscripted. This is, you know, this is the draft, so he really had no choice about this.
Wow, so he had to leave my grandmother with a newborn. My mom was just 4 months old then.
This next page here actually gives you details of his promotions in his military career.
That's the entire record?
That is.
Okay.
He goes from private, and then it's 2 subsequent promotions to private first class, and then to corporal.
So that's 3.
3. This is not the sort of career of a high-flying soldier.
Okay. But that could mean one of 2 things, right? That he wasn't A, enthusiastic, or B, he could just not be very talented as a soldier.
That could also be the case.
Okay.
Also, the regiment, I think, is significant. He begins in the 196th Artillery Regiment. The 196th was a unit that would be considered about 4th or 5th tier.
Oh.
So they'd generally be kept in the rear. And then if you were particularly good at what you were doing, you could find promotion to the frontline, you know, elite regiment.
Okay.
In the case of your grandfather, he doesn't seem to have done that. There were a couple of transfers later on, but they're into similar regiments.
What's surprising to me about these records is that, you know, growing up with my grandfather, he was this big, strong guy who was, you know, he would pick all of us up with one hand, and he was really athletic. So it's just so surprising to me to see these records, and it kind of, that depicts him as a very average soldier. So do you think that this kind of represents a lack of interest on his behalf, or a lack of sympathy for the war? Because it doesn't really match what I know about him.
On the balance of the evidence we have here, we've got him in a sort of third-rate division, with not much frontline service. He's not had an awful lot of promotion, so he's not sort of pushing to be promoted. He's not pleasing his superiors enough to be promoted. He's not someone who's showing any evidence, really, of being terribly enthusiastic.
Well, that's good to know.
So in a sense, he's one of those sort of the floating middle in Germany. You have a sort of an extreme one side who are very enthusiastic Nazis, and you have another extreme who would be oppositional and actively oppositional.
And what happened to the people that were really oppositional?
They were in trouble. They would find persecution and most probably death in many instances. But it's that floating middle is quite important. These are the sort of ordinary Germans who went along with the regime, but that doesn't mean they were necessarily keen Nazis. There's a difference between the two.
When I was growing up and I was a little girl, my grandfather specifically, I mean, whenever we brought up the war, there was a definite sense of embarrassment on his behalf. And so that led me to believe that he was kind of ashamed of any participation he had had, yet I could never really tell to what degree that participation was.
I think that sense of embarrassment is perfectly normal, actually,
Right.
in that generation of Germans, because they had, this sense of collective guilt for the crimes of Nazism. But that doesn't necessarily imply, as you have inferred, that he personally had anything to be ashamed of. And certainly the record here doesn't suggest that he has anything to be ashamed of at all.
Right, I see. So does this move on to tell us where he served in the war and where he spent most of his time?
As we said, he starts off in the 196th, so he's, primarily in Germany, more or less in a training capacity. The only incidents of true front combat service seems to be in the second half of 1942. He then it moves to the 12th Artillery Regiment, but it's still sort of 3rd or 4th rank regiment, and he is on the Eastern Front. So it would have been the area sort of to the west of Moscow.
Fighting the Russians.
Fighting the Soviet army, yeah.
That was a pretty brutal time, right?
Would have been very cold in the winter of 1942.
Yeah, it sounds...
And the combat would have been quite horrific. That seems to be his only real experience of front combat, which seems to be in the second half of 1942.
Okay, so if he was serving on the Eastern Front and he was fighting the Eastern Front, I know that he was taken around that time as a prisoner of war, but by the Americans.
Yes.
So...
Well, it shows you here your grandfather had a tremendous stroke of luck.
Oh, that's a nice switcheroo.